to talk about the Fama French model. Now, the Fama French model is pretty recent. It's from a 1992 paper. Again, finance is a big area of research in finance, the expected return on the firm's equity. And essentially what the Fama French model says, and again, we'll jump to an example and talk about it in a little more detail, but essentially what the Fama French model says is that the firm's systematic risk, in other words, the relationship between the market return and the firm return, is not the only thing that can be shown to be significant predictor of firm return. Right? And so what they did is they ran a bunch of statistical analysis trying to identify other things that seem to predict firm return other than just systematic risk exposure. And what they found are two other factors that seem to be highly significant predictors of return. The first one they noticed is that equity returns seem to be inversely related to the size of the company. And we saw that in the earlier graph, where we noticed that small firms have higher average returns in the stock market, 15%, relative to large firms, about 11%. And so, based on whether our company is big or small, we should expect that our company might have a larger or smaller expected return. The second thing that they noticed was that equity returns are positively related to the ratio of the book value to the market value of the company's equity, what we more commonly call book to market. And book to market is a ratio that typically measures investors' expectations about the company's future. And a lot of times we tend to use this as a proxy for the growth opportunities available to the firm. Because if the market value of the firm's equity is much greater than the book value of the firm's equity, that means that investors expect the firm to grow, and so that the book value of their equity now represents or catches up to the market value that has grown larger than that. And so instead of just using the one factor, which is the systematic risk factor, we use three factors, and that's why it's called a three-factor model. Systematic risk, the size of the company, and the book-to-market value of the company. And so we run a regression, and I'll show you an example here. Now, if we use the Fama French three-factor model to estimate the expected return for UPS, we expect to get numbers that are relatively similar to what we'd use when we do CAPM. In other words, CAPM might be underestimating risk because it's not accounting for these other factors, but it should be similar. And so we run our regression. Again, it's a little more complicated of a regression because we have three different factors that categories that we're regressing on. But we can see the relationship here in the Fama French three-factor model, and we get a cost of equity of 11.1%, which is a little higher. Remember CAPM back at the beginning of the lecture, we estimated CAPM, the cost of equity using CAPM, at about 8%. And so it's slightly higher, but not insane. And that's about what we expect. Now, the last thing, and again, this is just way more academic, it's that it's something called the arbitrage pricing theory. And the arbitrage pricing theory essentially says that based on the evidence that we have, we should be able to perfectly predict the expected return for a firm as long as we can perfectly account for all the risk factors that affect a firm's return or affect a firm's risk. So if I could enumerate every single risk affecting UPS and assign a premium to that risk, then I could perfectly predict their expected return. And we can see an attempt at this in CAPM, we found one factor. And then a better attempt with Fama French, we found three factors. And there's a common five-factor model or a four-factor model that are pretty widely used in academic finance. But the arbitrage pricing theory says, why stop there? We could have any number of factors as long as we have economic justification to them. Now, the problem with actually implementing the APT is that it doesn't provide any guidance on what those factors are. And we as academics haven't discovered all the potential factors that affect a firm's risk. So while the APT has beautiful math, it perfectly explains expected return in mathematics. Because I don't know what the other factors are, I can't perfectly explain expected return. And so that means that basically nobody uses this model, even though it is technically the perfect model. Everybody does use capital asset pricing model or Fama French. So that's how to think about and calculate the expected return for equity. In the next part of the lecture, we'll talk about calculating the expected return for debt or the cost of debt.